Welcome to the History Podcast. Today I'm going to take you on a real adventure to discover unknown lands. In 1976, the British Royal Society sent a promising cartographer and navigator, James Cook, to lead his own South Pacific expedition. His orders were to observe the astronomical phenomenon of the transit of Venus. However, this was not enough for the ambitious captain. After completing the original task, he continued his search of the legendary continent Terra Australis in the southern hemisphere. He ventured further and further, and the journey lasted from 1968 until 1971. 3 years after the captain returned to London, his reports from the expedition made him a real star. He was so famous that under the pressure of the adventurous society, he went on 2 more expeditions, and each of them discovered new, unknown places on Earth. Cook sailed over 350,000 kilometers during his career. That's almost the distance from the Earth to the Moon, and along the way, scientists that traveled with him documented the exotic fauna and flora, untouched landscapes, indigenous people, and much more. In addition to the South Pacific, the captain's journeys have taken him to South America, Antarctica, New Zealand, the South Pacific, as well as the Arctic Circle, Siberia, the East Indies, and the Indian Ocean. When he set off in 1768, more than a third of the globe was still unexplored. After 11 years, his output was so huge that some of the maps he created were still used in the 90s of the 20th century. Yes, 30 years ago, Cook's maps were still in use. This is a story about stubbornness and determination that can help you write history that will be remembered till the end of time. So let's set off with James Cook and explore the world. On the 7th of November, 1728, James Cook was born. He was baptized on November 14th at the parish church of St. Hubert, where his name can still be seen on the register today. He was the second of 8 children of James Cook Sr. from Scotland. When Cook was 8 years old, his family moved to Every Home Farm in Great Ayton, where his father's employer recognized Cook's sharpness and intelligence and paid for his schooling. In 1741, after 5 years of schooling, Cook started working for his father, who was promoted to farm manager. After work, he studied mathematics and astronomy on his own. He was also very fascinated by how maps are made. Cook was rather an introvert. When he had a spare moment for himself, he would climb the nearby hills and spend hours there enjoying his own company. In 1745, when Cook turned 16, it was time to leave his family. This was normal at this time. When children reached the age that allowed them to work, they set out to become independent. He moved 32 kilometers to the fishing village States to be apprenticed as a shopkeeper to grocer William Sanderson. Historians speculate that it was here that Cook first felt the temptation to sail the seas. Looking through the window at the shop, at the departing and returning ships in both calm and turbulent waters. After 18 months, it turned out that Cook was not a very good salesman, so he finished his shopkeeper training and went to a nearby port city. It was also there that he met John and Henry Walker. The Walkers were local ship owners in the coal industry. Cook insisted that he wanted to connect with the sea. Seeing the enthusiasm and potential of the young man, the Walkers agreed. Cook was hired as a merchant navy apprentice in their small fleet of coal ships along the coast of England. His first assignment was on the coal ship Free Love. Cook spent the next few years aboard on this vessel and many others plying goods up the Thames River of London. As an apprenticeship, he only tended the ship and did manual labor, but he also devoted himself to the study of algebra, geometry, trigonometry, and astronomy, all the skills required for a ship's captain, which he was not at the time, but to which he aspired. After completing his 3-year apprenticeship, Cook began working on merchant ships in the Baltic Sea. His career began to develop after passing the exams in 1752. He soon rose through the ranks of the merchant navy, beginning with a promotion. In 1755, after 3 years of hard work as a ship's officer, there was a breakthrough. Cook was offered command of the merchant ship Friendship, a dream come true, right? And Cook considered the offer, thought about it for a few days, and refused. Are you surprised? I was surprised too. Turns out Cook had a very thoughtful reason for doing this. Great Britain in 1755 was preparing for the 7 Years' War, which was to take place less than a year later. It was a war between Great Britain, Persia and Hanover, and France and Austria, Russia, Sweden and Saxony. It was essentially a world war. The fighting took place in Europe, North America, India and the Caribbean. In the later phase of the conflict, Spain and Portugal joined the war, as well as the Netherlands, initially trying to remain neutral, whose forces were attacked in India. This was a hegemonic war, and most of the powerful countries of the time took part in it. It was also a decisive phase in the nearly 100-year-old Franco-British struggle for supremacy in North America and in the world. But what does this have to do with Cook? I mentioned that he was a smart man. He knew that careers developed the fastest during wartime. So he knew that if he agreed to take command of a coal ship, he would indeed become a captain, but of a coal ship, and certainly until his death. It would be on this coal ship that he would spend every day of his life and carry coal back and forth until his death. And Cook wanted more, so much more. He wanted to explore. So within a month of being offered command of a coal ship, he volunteered for Royal Navy service. This marked a return to the lowest level of the hierarchy in the Navy, but Cook knew that his career would develop much faster. Cook's first military position was on a line ship, the strongest class of ship. Their feature was a strong artillery derived from the tactics of fighting in a line formation. For the first year, he served as a senior seaman and captain's mate under the command of Captain Joseph Harmer. In November 1755, he participated in the capture of one French warship and the sinking of another, after which he was promoted to boatswain. After 2 years of diligent military service, it was already clear to the leadership that Cook was really promising and that all his talents should be used. In June 1757, he passed all the master's examinations that qualified him to navigate and service ships in the Royal Fleet. Then he joined the frigate as the second captain under the command of Captain Robert Craig. Service during the 7-Year War allowed Cook for a fast promotion, but it was dangerous. During the war, Cook participated in major attacks such as the capture of the fortress of Louisbourg from the French and the siege of Quebec City. Throughout his service, he demonstrated a talent for surveying and cartography and was responsible for mapping most of the river estuaries. James Cook's surveying skills were later used to map the jagged Newfoundland coast in the 1760s while sailing aboard the HMS Greenville. Newfoundland is a large island off the eastern Atlantic coast of North America. Today it belongs to Canada. Mapping its shores was a task that Cook enjoyed very much. He was commissioned to discover and map a completely unknown coast, and discovering the unknown, as you remember, perfectly matched his aspirations and ambitions. For 4 years he sailed around Newfoundland and dutifully mapped this huge island. To get the job done even better, Cook employed navigators on his own to point out hidden dangers. Thanks to their help, Cook was able to sail deeper into the coasts and produce even more accurate maps. While in Newfoundland, Cook also made some astronomical observations, most notably the solar eclipse of August 5, 1766, obtaining an accurate estimate of the start and end time of the eclipse. News of this success was passed on to the Royal Society in 1767. What today is possible with one click on Google Maps, 250 years ago required many years of ship travel and complex calculations in 2 places of the world at once. I admit that sometimes it amazes me how science has gone and continues to move forward. After his success, Cook was on the rise. His 5th season in Newfoundland resulted in the first large-scale accurate maps of the Isle coast and the first large-scale scientific hydrographic surveys that used precise triangulation to establish land contours. During this period, Cook wrote in his diary, "I intend to go not only farther than any man has gone before, but as far as any man can go." He didn't yet realize how close his words would be to the truth. Cook was finally noticed by the presidents of the Royal Society, and they prepared for him quite a challenge. On February 16, 1768, the Royal Society asked King George III to fund a scientific expedition to the Pacific to study and observe the transit of Venus, to enable the measurement of the Earth's distance from the Sun, and the king agreed. The Venus transit, however, was only the official destination of the expedition. The Admiralty decided to combine a scientific trip with a secret mission. The 18th century was the time of growth for empires, and the elements that every empire was missing were lands and territories. Hence, it was decided to commission Cook with a mission to sail to the South Pacific in search of traces of a mythical continent, which was to be called Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern island. But what was this legendary Terra Australis? It was first placed on the theoretical map of the world by the Roman astronomer Claudius Ptolemy. He came to the conclusion that since most of the lands known to man lied in the northern hemisphere, there must also be some undiscovered vast lands in the south. That's why he drew a map of a huge continent with completely imaginary borders, which over the centuries took the name Terra Australis Incognita. Marco Polo later claimed to have seen the southern land called Lokak. It was supposed to be rich in gold and wild animals. Renaissance cartographers placed Lokak far to the south. However, no one had proved its existence in the era of great geographical discoveries. Numerous expeditions were set out in that direction, namely Portuguese and Spanish, but only the Dutch, looking for a route to the newly discovered East Indies, accidentally stumbled across a completely new land that would later become Australia. This continent was large, but there still remained an island somewhere below there that should be discoverable and inhabitable, far larger than Australia. Cook's scientific expedition was a good cause to verify these reports and potentially discover a new continent. If British sovereignty were to be established there, it would mean an exponential increase in its power. The goals of the expedition were then revealed to the press. It was written on the front pages of the journal. Tomorrow morning, Mr. Banks, Dr. Salino, Mr. Green the astronomer will join Captain Cook on board of the Endeavour to observe the transit of Venus and make discovery south and west of Cape Horn. So now we know what the two goals of the expedition were. It's now time to equip, as the journey was long and dangerous, so the ship also had to be special. The ship chosen by the authorities for the Voyager was a former merchantman, Earl of Pembroke. It was solid and built with a wide, flat bow. The flat bottom design made it well suited for shallow water navigation and allowed it to be beached for loading and unloading. Its length was 32 meters. This was the beginning of preparations. However, the Earl of Pembroke was purchased by the Admiralty and sailed to Deptford on the Thames to make further preparations. The cost of purchase in May 1768 was just under £3,000. This amount may not be impressive today, but consider the purchasing power of 250 years ago. Today, this ship would cost around £500,000. A third deck with gunpowder and additional storage was installed. In addition, 28 posts were installed to row the ship in case the mast was lost. After all these changes, in the end, the improved ship was given the name HMS Endeavour. For defense, the Endeavour was equipped with 10 4-powder cannons and 12 rotary cannons. Provisions loaded at the beginning of the voyage included 6,000 servings of pork, 4,000 servings of beef, 9 tons of bread, 5 tons of flour, 3 tons of sauerkraut, and 1 ton of raisins, and a large amount of salt, cheese, peas, oil, sugar, and oatmeal. Alcohol was also packed. First, it didn't spoil from the heat like water does, and second, it helped raise the morale of the crew. Liquor supplies consisted of 250 barrels of beer, 44 barrels of brandy, and 17 barrels of rum. This supply was supposed to last 18 months. Admiralty instructions for Captain Cook were placed in a special envelope for the inspection only by the captain. They were divided into 2 sections, both marked secret. Cook, upon arriving, was to open the first section, which spoke of arriving in Haiti and observing the passage of Venus, and only then the second section would be revealed, which I'll get to in a moment. On June 30th, 1768, the Admiralty formally authorized the entire crew for the voyage. This was a very significant event, as it was not possible to just sail on behalf of a country on a sea voyage. It had to be officially authorized. 73 sailors and 12 Royal Marines boarded the Endeavour. The cruise was commanded by the 40-year-old Lieutenant James Cook. His second lieutenant was Harry Hicks, and the third lieutenant was John Gore, a 16-year veteran of the Navy. Now that the ship is prepared and all the formalities are ready, let's set out on Cook's first expedition. He took care of the ship, crew, and equipment, and I have prepared for you a map of the route Cook took on his first expedition. Cook started the expedition from a British port on August 26, 1768. 3 months later, on November 17th, Endeavour crossed the entire Atlantic and reached as far as Rio de Janeiro. There it remained until December 2nd, resupplying and making repairs. Rio's ruler, Marquis de Azam, did not welcome Cook's visit. Marquis had been warned by the Portuguese government that Britain, after its victory in the 7 Years' War, was seeking to expand its overseas power and influence. So he suspected that observing the transit of Venus was not Britain's only or main goal. Cook felt offended by the ruler's suspicion, but did not say a word. In his diary, however, he described Guanabara Bay in detail, including the level of defense fortifications, and recorded that the city could be captured with a force of 6 line ships. What's the harm of such information if there was actually a conflict, right? After leaving Rio, Cook sailed further south along South America. On January 16, 1769, the Endeavour passed Cape Horn. He then headed further west, across the Pacific, and taking advantage of good weather, and arrived in Haiti 3 months later, in April 1769. Observations of Venus were to be made there. The transit of Venus was to take place on June 3rd, so Cook still had enough time to spare. He ordered the construction of a small fort and observatory on the northern slice of the island, at a place known as Point Venus. The observatory was built just in time for the approaching transit of Venus. A delegated astronomer, Charles Green, accompanied the measurement. The main purpose of this observation was to maintain measurements that could be used to more accurately calculate the distance of Venus from the Sun. If this could be accomplished, then the distances from the other planets could be calculated, and ultimately the distance between any 2 points on Earth, thus solving the problem of accurately determining longitude. On the day of the observation, Cook recorded in his diary, "Saturday. This day proves to be as favorable to our purpose as we could wish. Not a cloud is visible, and the air is perfectly clear, so that we have every opportunity and advantage in observing the entire passage of Venus over the Sun's disk. Dr. Solander observed this phenomenon with me, as does Mr. Green. To be sure, the measurements were correct. They were taken simultaneously by Cook, Solander, and Green. Unfortunately, after comparing the measurements with each other, they differ by more than the acceptable margin of error." This unfortunately meant that this part of the expedition was not successful. Today, scientists surmise that Cook was defeated by optical phenomena that prevented accurate measurements, especially with the instruments used at the time. This is really not difficult. I draw your attention to the fact that the researchers were looking directly at the Sun and trying to track the tiny dot that briefly appeared in front of it, which was Venus. A difficult task, even by today's standards. The observations were completed, and Cook opened the sealed orders for the second part of his journey, and it was only then that he clearly realized, although he had suspected it beforehand, that an epoch-making task had been assigned. The Crown of the Empire commissioned him to search the South Pacific for traces of the legendary southern continent of Terra Australis. The Royal Society believed that it must exist, and that Britain's best chance of discovering it and seizing it before any other European power would be to use a mission commanded by Cook. He took note of the orders, but it will probably come as no surprise to you that he did not want to head south right away. Taking advantage of the fact that he was almost at the other end of the world, he decided to first explore other nearby islands, not far from Haiti. A local priest and sailor named Tupaja volunteered to join him. He proved indispensable as a sailor, translator, and intermediary between the Endeavour crew and local residents. The Endeavour left Haiti on July 13th and sailed to the port of nearby Hua Hin Island 3 days later. There, Cook presented the chief with a plaque as a lasting testimony to our first discovery of the island. From Hua Hin, he sailed to a neighboring island, Rayati, and on July 20th raised the British flag there and declared it and the neighboring islands, Hua Hin, Bora Bora, Tupai, and Maurua, to be British property. He called them Society Islands because they lay next to each other as if they were in their own society. Only then, having satisfied his lust for discovery, on August 9th, Cook raised the anchor and sailed south in search of the southern continent, as instructed by the Admiralty. In fact, he sailed completely straight south. At the beginning of September, he traveled about 2,500 kilometers. The Endeavour reached the 40th degree of south latitude, but further on, no alleged continent was spotted. According to instructions, if no land was encountered by the 40th degree of latitude, Cook was then to turn west and head to New Zealand, maintaining a course of between 29 and 40 degrees of latitude. After a month of sailing in the rough Pacific, Cook reached New Zealand. This took place on October 6, 1769. On that day, he became the second European in history to reach the country. Cook and his crew arrived on October 7th in Poverty Bay. There, he met for the first time people quite different from Europeans, the New Zealand Maori. According to research, the Maori are the descendants of clans of the Polynesians from the islands of the eastern Pacific Ocean. Haiti were the first people to reach the shores of the South Island between 900 and 1300 AD. According to legends, they arrived on 7 giant sailboats and each gave rise to one tribe. The commander of the earliest arriving boat is credited with discovering the land of the White Cloud, as the Maori call New Zealand. Archaeological excavations, however, prove that the first Maori arrived in several waves and settled on the South Island. They conquered both New Zealand islands relatively quickly, however, strongly preferred the warmer and more hospitable North Island. The Maori farmed, fished, and practiced cannibalism. They were famous for their bellicosity and artistic talents in building sculpture and tattooing. Maori tattoos are one of the most important elements of their culture. Tattooing was a ceremony and a kind of initiation full of pain. Maori tattoos were made with simple sharp tools, mainly from shark teeth or albatross bones. Each symbol in Maori tattoos has its own unique meaning and tells a specific story. Tattoos on the face symbolize social status and achievement. Women were tattooed exclusively by Brody. How Maori people differed from Europeans amazed Cook and his crew. The meeting of European and Maori cultures was intended to be peaceful. Unfortunately, within the first 2 days of arrival, there was an accident with the Maori due to probably a complete misunderstanding of gestures and words of the two sides that resulted in a brawl and the death of 5 Maori. 3 more Maori died a few days later. It was truly difficult for Cook. The entries in his diary reflect his regret that he did not follow his instructions to avoid hostilities with the indigenous people of any nations he encountered. Further encounters with the Maori were more peaceful, and Tupaja, who understood the Maori language, played a very important role as interpreter and mediator between the parties. The Maori traded freely with the Europeans and allowed them to collect water and plants. Sailing north, the Endeavour then anchored in Mercury Bay, where Cook observed the transit of Mercury on November 9th. Relations with the Maori they encountered there were generally peaceful, although one local was again killed in a trade dispute. This was the last recorded death of a Maori at the hands of Cook's crew. After raising the flag and formally granting Mercury Bay sovereignty to Britain, Cook sailed from the bay on November 15, 1769. His intention was to circumnavigate New Zealand from the north, plotting it on maps and returning to the starting point. Continuing north around New Zealand, Cook nearly met up with a French expedition that was circling the Cape at the same time in the opposite direction. After a brief forced stop due to storms, Cook continued to advance along the west coast of the North Island. In mid-January, Cook reached Queen Charlotte Sound on the south coast of New Zealand's South Island. That's right, South Island. Today, we know that New Zealand consists of 2 large North and South Islands. In those days, however, New Zealand was about as well explored as Jupiter is today. Cook was the second European to go there, so how much of an astonishment it was when on January 22nd, 1770, Cook circled the North Island, climbed to the top of Kaitapea and saw the strait separating the North Island from the newly discovered South Island. The strait was named the Cook Strait. This was an incredibly important moment. Firstly, it proved that New Zealand consisted of at least 2 islands, and secondly, that New Zealand was not part of the supposed southern continent. Cook's mission could have been a success. In order to prove it, however, it had to be tested, and Cook did not hesitate. The Endeavour set sail on February 5th, passing through Cook Strait. They turned south and sailed along the east coast of the South Island, charting the coast and continuing the search for the southern continent. On March 10th, they sailed to the Southwest Cape, which is the last cape south of New Zealand, and was not expected to end so soon. All that was left was to turn back north. This proved that the South Island was not the sought-after 6th continent either. Terra Australis remained a legendary land. Cook continued north along the west coast of the South Island, then re-entered Cook Strait and turned toward Admiralty Bay. On March 27th, the circumnavigation of southern New Zealand came to an end. Cook gave himself 3 days to digest what he had discovered, and the conclusions were groundbreaking. After 3 days, Cook wrote in his diary, "The accomplishments of the endeavor under my command made it possible to set aside most, if not all, of the arguments and evidence that have been presented by various authors to prove that there must be a southern continent. I certify that at 40 degrees south latitude there is no such continent. Further, however, I do not know what can lie south of this latitude." After sailing away from New Zealand, Cook began preparing to return to Britain. On April 20th, the Endeavour reached the vicinity of Point Hicks on the east coast of Australia. Lieutenant Zachary Hicks was the first to sight an unknown land. Endeavour was the first European ship to reach the east coast of Australia, while rough seas and winds prevented it from arriving on shore. Sailing up the east coast of Australia, the British found trees, plants, and fish previously unknown. On April 29th, the Endeavour sailed into Botany Bay. It was then that Cook first noticed Aborigines. According to today's genetic studies, both Aborigines and Papuans are direct descendants of the community that first left Africa. Their ancestors arrived in Australia, according to various sources, 50,000 years ago. Aborigines led a nomadic lifestyle. They were dependent on and connected to their environment. Their primary activities included hunting and gathering, and in coastal areas also fishing. When Cook reached Australia in 1770, there were about 600 distinct Aboriginal tribes using at least 500 languages. Interestingly, the Aborigines, unlike the Maori, showed indifference to the Europeans. But their indifference was not Cook's biggest problem. A much bigger problem at the time was the growing irritation of the crew, already fed up with the protracted expedition. As if that wasn't enough, on June 11th, the Endeavour hit a large coral reef, which pierced the bottom of the ship. The entire crew, including the scientists, worked at pumping out the water. On June 18th, a week after hitting the reef, Endeavour entered a river, later named Endeavour. Located near present-day Cooktown, the ship was repaired and the area was surveyed. On April 23rd, the crew saw kangaroos for the first time, and later also dingo dogs, alligators, and bats. The name kangaroo was a distorted form of the name Ganguru, derived from the language of the local people. Perceptions of Aboriginal people by the ship's crew varied. Cook expressed kindness about the natives. Mr. Banks, on the other hand, places the indigenous people of Australia between humans and animals. According to Cook's account, the crew considered the natives generally as primitive people, uninterested in European goods. However, Cook recorded in his diary at the time that due to their ignorance of money or commodities, the Aborigines didn't feel social inequality, which allowed them to live in peace. A very interesting observation, isn't it? On August 22nd, the Endeavour sailed to the York Peninsula, and again they had to overcome the dangerous coral reef. However, Cook had some reason to celebrate. Up to that point, he had not lost a single man to scurvy. This was a virtually unprecedented achievement in the 18th century for long-distance shipping. So how did he achieve this? Cook convinced his men to eat such foods as citrus and sauerkraut. At the time, it was known that a poor diet caused scurvy, but it was not known specifically that vitamin C deficiency was the main reason. Nevertheless, Cook's choice, although intuitive, was as accurate as possible. Scurvy is a rare multi-organ disease that is caused precisely by lack of vitamin C. Other names of the disease are rot. Scurvy is a very dangerous and painful disease. Its symptoms include inflammatory overgrowth of the gums, muscle pain, joint pain, bone breakage, loss of appetite, bleeding of the blood vessels, anemia, and depression. In the advanced phase of the disease, there are neurological disorders of convulsions and loss of consciousness. Scurvy was a true maritime scourge, and efforts were made to combat it in every known way. Cook was the first to correctly identify poor diet as the cause of scurvy. However, a problem remained, as sailors were opposed to innovation and did not want to eat sauerkraut. Instead of persuading or ordering, Cook used a method used with young children. One day, he simply ordered that from then on, the cook served sauerkraut only to the captain and the officers. The rest of the crew got the standard rusks and dried meat. After a week, the rest of the sailors rebelled and demanded equal treatment. From then on, they all ate sauerkraut together, and scurvy was averted. This psychological trick is worth remembering. In September 1770, Cook sailed north between Australia and Indonesia. On October 5th, the Endeavour arrived in the Batavia of today's Jakarta. While there, almost the entire crew fell ill with typhoid fever or cholera. As a result of the epidemic, 7 crew members died, including, unfortunately, Tupaja. After a 10-week overhaul, the Endeavour went on its way. Another epidemic became a serious problem, this time dysentery. Among those who died of the disease were astronomer Charles Green, draftsman Sidney Parkinson, and carpenter John Satterley. The death of a large part of the crew depressed the rest. Nonetheless, the journey continued. 11 weeks after departing Batavia, Endeavour finally arrived in South America on March 15, 1771. The final phase of the return journey had begun. 4 months later, Endeavour sailed up the La Mancha Canal on July 10, 1771. On July 12 at 6 a.m., the Endeavour anchored in the Downs. At the time, 3 years had passed since the expedition started, and no one expected a successful return. Newspapers and journals had long reported fears that the Endeavour was lost at sea or had been destroyed by the French. Cook's diaries, along with Banks's, were handed over to a shocked Admiralty for publication upon his return. Cook did not want to say goodbye to the sea for a long time, so he used a delicate manipulation. In his report, he stated that the mysteries of the Southland could only be clarified in another expedition, which would cover areas below 40 and up to 60 degrees south latitude, or in other words, lower than before. Cook made similar statements at balls and meetings to which he was regularly invited. So finally, the Admiralty was convinced by Cook's proposal and put him in command of another expedition. Its purpose was to circumnavigate the world even further south than before, and in this way we too are about to set out again around the world. This time 2 ships were to set off. James Cook commanded the HMS Resolution, while Tobias Forno commanded the companion ship HMS Adventure. The Resolution began her career as a 462-ton coral carrier in the North Sea, converted to naval specifications at a cost of nearly £7,000. She was 34 meters long and 11 meters wide. She was equipped with the most advanced navigation systems of the time, including an azimuth compass, ice anchors, and the latest apparatus for distilling fresh water from seawater. HMS Adventure also began her career as a coral carrier. She was built in Whitby in 1771 and was purchased by the Navy in the same year. She was 30 meters long, 8 meters wide, and had a draft of 4 meters. She also had 10 cannons. The supplies loaded onto these ships were much larger than on the previous expedition. 27 tons of rusks, 7 tons of salted beef, 14 tons of salted pork, 17 tons of beer, 6,000 liters of strong alcohols, and 2,000 kilograms of fat. To counteract scurvy, 20 tons of sauerkraut and 140 liters of carrot juice were loaded. But that's not all. The expedition was to be so long that both ships this time even took animals: sheep, goats, pigs, and poultry. However, to make themselves even more independent of the supplies they took, the ships carried fishing equipment and water purification systems used to distill seawater. They also took on board a great variety of trinkets such as knives, axes, beads, ribbons, and medallions. The intention was to use these items to barter or as gifts for the natives. 90 sailors and 18 Marines boarded the Resolution, while 81 crew members boarded the Adventure. As before, this time I have also prepared for you a map of the second expedition to help you understand where you are currently. James Cook's second voyage left Britain on Monday, July 13th, 1772, almost exactly 1 year after they returned from the first expedition. As you remember, previously the ship sailed across the Atlantic to South America and further south. This time, the route was different. They sailed along Africa. The first stop was Madeira off the northern coast of Africa, which Cook reached on August 1st. He spoke highly of the sailing qualities of his new ship Resolution and wrote in his first report to the Admiralty, She steers, works, and sails well. She is extremely stiff and seems to be a dry and easy ship at sea. The ship was resupplied with fresh water, beef, fruits and vegetables, and after another supply stop in the Cape Verde Islands. Both ships reached the Cape of Good Hope in the very south of Africa. It was here that the Swede Anders Sparman joined the expedition as a botanist. From the moment Cook left southern Africa, he had detailed instructions for the expedition. The ships were to head as far south as possible, into the unknown in search of a cape spotted in 1739 by the French traveller Jean-Baptiste Bouvet. It was believed that this cape could be part of Terra Australis. Upon reaching this cape, Cook was to figure out whether it was part of a larger landmass or a fragment of some island. If the cape was a part of a landmass, it was recommended that solid and varied surveys be carried out, and it was also recommended to find out whether the new lands discovered were populated. If, on the other hand, the cape turned out to belong only to an island or even failed to be found at all, the ships were to turn to the east and then attempt to reach as far south as possible or discover the shores of the southern continent. If the weather conditions worsened, the crews were to turn to the north, replenish their supplies whenever they could, and with the advent of more favorable weather, resume their journey south. The ships left the African Cape of Good Hope on November 22, 1772, and headed in an almost straight line for the South Atlantic region. Soon after sailing, the weather began to deteriorate drastically. As a result of frigid conditions, the crew began wearing all the clothes they had on board. By early December, visibility had dropped to a few tens of meters, and they were already sailing in thick fog. The speed dropped significantly. To make matters worse, icebergs also began to appear around them. Despite this, both ships pushed further south. Cook was unable to find the island mentioned by Bouvet. On January 17, 1773, ice soon surrounded the ships. As weather conditions began to worsen further, Cook decided to turn back north. At this point, however, the ships began to drift more toward the east. Temperatures dropped to such an extent that for several days the water on board froze, and in order to drink, it had to be heated over a fire. However, this was not the end of the troubles. On February 8th, in conditions of fatally poor visibility, the Resolution crew lost contact with the Adventure ship. After desperate attempts lasting several hours to spot the other ship again, Cook gave up. While it's difficult for me to imagine the terror that I would have felt in this situation, Cook kept his cool and decided to continue sailing northeast. Further delay and exploration would have endangered everyone's safety, so at least one ship could potentially continue the mission of exploration, a difficult but necessary decision. Ferdinand, meanwhile, in command of the Adventure, was safe and healthy along with his crew, although just as lost as Cook. Ferdinand directed the ship to a pre-arranged meeting point in Queen Charlotte Sound in New Zealand. During their journey, Adventure explored the southern and eastern coasts of Tasmania, and Ferdinand made the earliest British map of this coast. Meanwhile, aboard the Resolution, Cook continued his exploration to the southeast, reaching latitude 61 on February 24th. In mid-March, he decided to proceed to Dusky Bay on the South Island of New Zealand, where he anchored until April 30th. In the meantime, they replenished the water and food supplies, hunted birds and seals, conducted environmental and terrain reconnaissance in the areas they visited, and interacted with small groups of natives. After leaving Dusky Bay, Cook sailed towards Queen Charlotte's Bay, where the Adventure crew was expected to meet, assuming they were still alive. On May 18th, they sailed toward their destination. The mast and then the outline of the entire ship appeared on the horizon. The Adventure, commanded by Ferdinand as expected, had been there for 6 weeks. The joy was endless. Consider the relief that both sides must have felt when finding themselves in these boundless waters. All in all, it was truly amazing. After a brief celebration, both ships sailed from New Zealand and began the next leg of the journey, which you can see well on the map. In their search for southern land, they sailed in 2 circles in the Pacific Ocean, the first smaller and the second much larger. On August 15th, 1773, both ships reached the Mahetia Islands in what is now French Polynesia. A short stop was made there, during which the trinkets and items brought were exchanged with the natives for coconuts and bananas. On August 24th, the journey to the next island, which was the real destination of this leg, the Tahiti voyage, began. Matavai Bay was designated as the base. Between September 2nd and 3rd, they crossed once again a short distance to the island of Hua Hin, discovered by Cook on the previous expedition. With permission from Furneaux, the adventure ship's crew was joined by a local native named Omei from the island of Rayati. Remember this name, as it will appear again in the context of the next expedition. During the visits to all the archipelago islands, the same pattern was consistently repeated. Crews interacted with the local communities, engaged in bartering, and participated in games. They also learnt about and shared in the local culture, exchanged gifts, and celebrated mutual encounters for a long time. In mid-September, the crews left the Society Islands and headed west. In early October, Resolution sailed to the Tonga Islands. According to Cook's account, the natives swam out in shoals to welcome the ship and came aboard. After the ship landed on the beach, they treated the crew to a welcome party consisting of bananas, coconuts, and coffee. It was not the coffee we know, but the one spelled kava. Cook was the only one who tried to drink this. The rest of the crew feared it was poison. However, Cook knew that he had to taste the speciality, even at the cost of his life, for it risked offending the natives and potentially causing a massacre. But Cook had nothing to fear. For millennia, the kava drink has been prepared in these regions to celebrate all important private, political, and religious gatherings. The plant has grown to such a high profile that its image can be found on coins, banknotes, and flags. Every country and even Pacific culture has its own traditions and rituals related to the preparation, serving, and drinking of kava. In the past, it was drunk only by men. Today, in almost all the islands, it is also done by women. The kava drink is very intense and strong. Research confirms that it has a slight psychoactive effect, calms, relaxes, and makes it easier to fall asleep. The strength of the effect depends on several factors. One of the most important is hunger. Kava taken on an empty stomach will have a stronger effect. Depending on the dose, the effect can last for a few minutes to several hours. Cook was not only impressed by the effects of kava, but also by the cult of the Tahama of the Holy Child. He saw this as an analogy to Christianity, even though the natives were not familiar with European religions. Cook and his crew stayed in the islands for several days before setting sail to New Zealand on the 25th of March, 1774. Next day, the crews were surprised by a storm, which again separated the ship's Resolution and Adventure, this time permanently. When Cook's crew sailed into Queen Charlotte's Bay on November 1st, Furneaux had given up. He made the decision to return to the UK via the Pacific Ocean and around Cape Horn. The ship Adventure arrived in England on 14th July 1774. For Cook, however, the first smaller circumnavigation of the Pacific had only just come to an end. On 26th November, he and his crew set off from New Zealand for a second time, this time planning to sail a much wider staggered circle in the Pacific. The aim was again to search for the southern continent. The Resolution reached 67 degrees latitude, but had to turn back on the 22nd of December due to thick fog, strong winds, and lingering ice caps. For nearly a month, the ship sailed to the northeast before being diverted again to the southeast in mid-January. On January 30th, 1775, the expedition reached a latitude of 71 degrees, a location already very low on the globe. However, no habitable land was in sight further south. Cook made the difficult decision that a further voyage, although still theoretically possible, would already be too dangerous. He concluded that even if there was land further south, it would be entirely covered by ice and therefore uninhabitable. This means that Terra Australis Incognita, if it existed, would not be habitable by any living being. Although Roald Amundsen might have a different opinion on this, Cook came to a very bitter conclusion. It probably comes as no surprise to hear that, just as before, after failing to observe the passage of Venus and deciding to continue his adventures, Cook did not take the course home. Despite his failure, he still wanted to carry out a number of studies in the Pacific Ocean, so he headed straight north. Will you be surprised when I tell you where he got to? Well, on the 11th of March 1775, the members of the expedition reached Easter Island and spent 5 whole days there. At that time, the officers Pickles Geo and Ivelios traversed the island and made a description of its environment, the natives, and above all, the Moai statues mentioned earlier by the discoverer of the island, Jacob Rockavane in 1722. You may be familiar with the elongated black faces buried in the earth. These are statues that can weigh more than 18 tons and stand over 6 meters tall. The largest of these Moai, a statue called Paro, was about 10 meters tall and weighed 75 tons. An unfinished figure was found that was 21 meters high and weighed 270 tons. While the rest of the crew marveled at the figures, something else caught Cook's attention. He noticed that there were hardly any trees on the island. This was the start of a thesis that the figures were probably rolled on logs to their destination and put upright with the help of ropes. The locals' intensive exploration of the island and their consumption of large quantities of wood to transport the Moai may have contributed to the island being completely stripped of trees. Once again, Cook's great perceptiveness shines through. After departing from Easter Island, the Resolution headed southwest towards the Marquesas Archipelago, arriving on April 6th. The crew visited 4 islands in succession: Fatuhaku, Mohotani, Hivaoa, and Dahuata. They stopped for a few days on the last island and made contact with the locals. Unfortunately, there was also an incident which resulted in the death of one of the islanders. Cook recorded in his diary that he was guilty of theft and that the death was not the result of deliberate action by the crew, but of self-defense. On the 21st of April, the Resolution reached Tahiti for the second time during the expedition. Cook then steered the expedition towards New Zealand again, but this time along a slightly more westerly route. Among other things, the route led through the Hapai Archipelago. Cook discovered and described in detail the New Caledonian and Norfolk Islands. And so the second wider circumnavigation of the Pacific was completed. In November 1775, it was time to end the expedition, so Cook headed for Europe. During the return journey, the expedition made successive stops at the Cape of Good Hope, the Islands of Ascension, the St. Helena Islands, and the Azores. They finally returned home at the end of July the following year. During the expeditions, Resolution lost 4 men. 1 crew member died of tuberculosis, 2 drowned, and 1 died as a result of falling into the cargo hold of the ship. On the adventure, 13 people died. As before, James Cook brought back an immense amount of knowledge, geographical, botanical, and astronomical. There would have been enough material for dozens of scientific papers. However, Cook's most important contribution was finally dispelling the myth of Terra Australis in his reports upon returning home. Cook brought back bitter but true proof that there were only endless masses of ice in the southern hemisphere. There was nowhere a habitable southern continent. In recognition of his merits after the second expedition, Cook was awarded the Copley Medal. This award is given by the Royal Society of London for excellence in research in any branch of science. It is the oldest and most prestigious award given by the Society. After returning from his second expedition, Cook had become a top-level celebrity. He was the first person to circumnavigate the globe further south than anyone had before him, and had overcome ice, wind, hostile natives, and tropical diseases. Cook enjoyed his newfound status. Every evening, he was invited to recitals in his honor, where he regaled audiences with stories from his travels. Although the Royal Navy was proud of its captain, it also saw him as a national asset that needed protecting. As a result, he was withdrawn from active service and given the post of director of the Naval Hospital at Greenwich. Cook was to spend his retirement in peace. By 1776, the British king had more pressing concerns than Terra Australis. Specifically, the War of Independence for the British colonization of the United States had been raging for a year. If the American colonies succeeded in gaining independence, the British Empire would lose a critical trade route from America to Europe. New trade routes needed to be discovered urgently. One such route, which had yet to be discovered, was the legendary Northwest Passage. This is a maritime route that connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean, using waterways inside the Arctic archipelago to the north of North America. In other words, it's a route that allows maritime travel from Europe to the Pacific Ocean via the top of the globe. Its discovery would have saved many kilometers of travel in sailing from Europe to Asia. Europeans had sought the passage for 300 years as an alternative route between Europe and Asia. In Cook's time, the existence of the passage was still only a theoretical concept. It was not until many years later that the passage's existence was confirmed by the British polar explorer Robert McClure. He traveled the passage from west to east on a ship and sled between 1850 and 1853. The first to complete the passage in its entirety, though in several stages, was the Norwegian polar explorer and later South Pole conqueror Roald Amundsen. He, however, is far in the future. At the end of the 18th century, in the time of James Cook, the discovery of the passage would have been a world event, forever inscribing its discoveries in the pages of history. We can safely assume that Cook was fishing for this prospect, considering what we know about him. This was highly probable after the king announced that the discoverer of the passage would receive a reward equivalent of $15 million today. As a result, Cook's retirement had to be postponed. Of course, it was not publicly revealed that Cook was assigned to discover the new strategic route. It was announced that the captain was setting out to take home Omei, who had been brought back from Tahiti. For 4 years, Omei had been a local attraction for British nobles. Let's prepare with Cook for his final expedition. Unfortunately, I use the word final here not by accident. I advise you to take more armaments with you than before. On his last voyage, Captain Charles Clark commanded the HMS Discovery, while James Cook again commanded the HMS Resolution, which we know from the previous expedition. The ship had a large amount of livestock on board, including sheep, cattle, goats, pigs, and poultry. Cook also ordered 100 knitted jackets, 60 waistcoats, and 40 pairs of breeches, as well as 120 knitted waistcoats to be taken for bartering with the natives. Additionally, the ship carried 400 dresses, 500 pairs of stockings, 80 caps, and 800 pairs of shoes. As before in the description of the episode, I have prepared a map for you for this expedition. So let's set off. Captain Cook sailed from Britain on July 12, 1776. However, problems arose right from the start. Clark in Discovery experienced a delay and did not sail until August 1st. On the way to Cape Town, the Resolution stopped at Tenerife to replenish supplies. It was there that Cook noticed that Resolution was leaking and needed to be sealed as a matter of urgency. When Discovery arrived on November 10th, it was found to also need sealing. I'm not superstitious, but such a disastrous start to an expedition would have made me think twice. On December 1st, 1776, both ships set sail for the west. 2 months later, on February 12th, Cook arrived in New Zealand for the third time in his life. After a 2-week layover, the ship set sail for Tahiti. However, strong winds carried them several tens of kilometers to Manganja, where the island was first sighted on March 29th. To resupply, the ships departed with westerly winds for the friendly islands known as Tonga. The ships remained there until mid-July before they returned to Tahiti. As you may recall from the second expedition, Cook had completed 2 circumnavigations of the Pacific. However, this time the objective was different: to head straight north and reach the northern coast of America. And further afield, of course, to attempt to sail over the mountain from Western America to Europe. On the 18th of January, 1778, Cook became the first European to visit the Hawaiian Islands. He then sailed to the northeast to explore the west coast of North America, constantly moving along the American coast in search of the Northwest Passage. They anchored near the village of Jacot, which is located on an island near Vancouver, very close to today's American-Canadian border. While at Jacot, the crew went ashore. Relations between the crew and the Jacot people were cordial, though sometimes strained. During trade, the Jacot people demanded much more valuable items than the trinkets that Cook's crew usually used in Hawaii, for example. The most valuable trade item that the British received was not the gold they had hoped for, but rather sea otter skins. After a month's stay, the Jacot people were actually controlling the trade with the British, not the other way around. The natives were boarding and disembarking British ships all the time. After replenishing their supplies, it was time to sail further north. Along the way, Cook surveyed and mapped the coast as far as the Bering Strait. In the second week of August 1778, Cook passed through the Bering Strait, which lies between Asia and North America. By doing so, he entered the frigid Chukchi Sea. From then on, he sailed towards the mountains, getting closer to the Northwest Passage than ever before. A very frosty wind was constantly blowing, and drinking water was freezing constantly. Cook was heading northeast along the Alaskan coast when he suddenly had the misfortune of being completely blocked by sea ice at 70 degrees latitude. In an attempt to circumnavigate it, he headed west, but the situation had already become critical. There was ice everywhere. The ship circled the sea for a while longer, but James Cook eventually had to raise the white flag. The Northwest Passage was defeated by the ice, leaving no chance of getting through to Europe. At the beginning of September 1778, Cook started his journey back to Hawaii, during which he became increasingly frustrated and aggressive. He also suffered from stomach ailments. Captain Cook exhibited irrational behavior towards his crew, such as forcing them to eat walrus meat, which the British considered inedible. The entire crew had already noticed Cook's strange behavior, susceptibility to irritation, and attacks of aggression. Today we know that this was not a change in character, but rather a result of illnesses contracted by Cook. However, at the time, it appeared as if the situation had simply overwhelmed him, and he began to take it out on his crew. On the 17th of January 1779, both ships returned to Hawaii. As on their first visit, the natives treated the crew with reverence. More than 1,000 small boats sailed out to greet Cook and his crew. On that day, Cook made the last entry in his diary. Lieutenant James Kings's account provides further information about the expedition's time in Hawaii. According to King, the welcome was very unusual. The natives greeted Cook and his men with the song Lono. They fell on their hands and knees and bowed their foreheads to the ground. Cook and his men were then led to a waterfront temple with a wooden platform decorated with 20 human skulls. A priest named Koa led Cook through a series of rituals. The captain climbed onto the raised platform, where Koa wrapped him in a red cloth. Together they struck their foreheads in front of the carved images and kissed them. The priest and captain then recited prayers while the Hawaiians continued to sing Lono. At the end of the ceremony, Cook was presented with sugarcane, bananas, and coconuts. The ceremonies concluded with another priest anointing Cook's body with coconut pulp. During the first few days in the Gulf of Hawaii, sailors mainly relaxed. While staying there, Charles Clark became the first European to describe surfing. According to his account, Hawaiians called the sport Henalu. In turn, accounts written at the beginning of the 19th century suggest that Hawaiians were fascinated by the British and their strange and seemingly magical activities. According to the islanders, the ship's crew had loose, wrinkly skin. This may have been due to their clothing, since the natives were naked. For Hawaiians, pockets were holes for treasures in the body. Europeans were said to have angular heads, though it was probably their hats that deceived the natives. According to the locals, when a Briton started smoking a pipe, a volcano would appear in their mouth. Writing was viewed as a form of decoration by the natives. Women were fascinated by mirrors, while men were fond of metal objects. At the Moana Loa, islanders would gather a mountain of food and objects and entertain guests with boxing and wrestling shows. However, to Cook's surprise, and in contrast to previous expeditions, the hosts quickly became impatient. This was especially puzzling given the warm welcome they had initially received. It was unclear whether Cook and his crew were in danger or whether the hosts were simply restless. These mixed signals were difficult for Europeans to interpret. It was as if someone had welcomed you to their home with bread and salt, had a wedding in your honor, and then became very angry at your presence. To make matters worse, just 2 weeks after arriving on the island, the king and the chiefs began asking when the British would finally sail away. Preparations for departure were then accelerated, and on February 4th, 1779, the Resolution and Discovery sailed from the Gulf. Unfortunately, fate had a surprise in store for both crews. The base of the mast's foresail on the Resolution had overturned so much that it had begun to shift from the plate attaching it to the hull, and the ship was also leaking. Emerging storms just over a week later forced Cook to decide to return to the Gulf. The ships needed repairs, and there was no chance of returning to Europe under their own power in this condition. As predicted, the return of the ships on February 10th caused great anxiety among the natives. After 3 days, the anxiety of the islanders turned into aggression. They attacked sailors, mocked British soldiers, and robbed ships. During one of the attacks, a scuffle broke out, and one sailor hit the chief with an oar. In response, the mob pelted the sailors with stones, and 2 of them were beaten. During the chaotic pursuit of the man he was accused of, Cook stole the armorer's pincers. He was so upset that he ordered the muskets to be loaded with live ammunition, bringing the conflict to the brink of open warfare. To make matters worse, the ships could not sail away until they were repaired. On the 14th of February 1779, the natives stole one of the smaller boats used to transport people between the moored ships and the shore. Cook, feeling exasperated, ordered a blockage of the bay and instructed his crew to fire upon the natives if they tried to approach the ship. At 7 a.m., Cook and 10 soldiers swam ashore. Cook intended to capture the chief and hold him until the stolen goods were recovered. This behavior was completely baffling to his crew. Cook was becoming increasingly dogmatic and aggressive, completely different from the gentleman and leader he had been on the 2 previous expeditions. The captain and soldiers traveled to the chief's village, where the king of the island surrendered and agreed to board the ship. However, as the Britons and the king's entourage approached the bay, they were unexpectedly ambushed by armed Hawaiians emerging from the jungle. Cook and his soldiers found themselves surrounded by a large crowd of several thousand men, and a final clash appeared imminent. Recognizing the significant advantage of the locals, Cook abandoned his plan to take the king hostage. He ordered the soldiers to evacuate and board the boats, but a Havana man in the crowd began waving an iron dagger and threatened to attack the captain. Cook fired a pistol loaded with gunshot shells. The noise frightened the Havana man, who began throwing stones and spears at the English. Cook fired a second time, killing one man in the crowd, and then ordered the soldiers to fire into the crowd and flee to the ships. However, before they could reload their weapons, enraged Hawaiians rushed into the bay. Soldiers who were on the boats joined the fight. Captain Cook panicked as he tried to reach the boathouse. Some men in one lifeboat began rowing towards the fight to rescue the captain, while others in 2 boats commanded by John Williamson moved away into the bay. Just as Cook was almost safe, almost 10 meters away from the lifeboat, he was unfortunately seized by the Hawaiian men and carried immediately inland. One of the natives, named Kalani Mano, suddenly attacked Cook by striking him on the back of the head with a large club. The warrior was very surprised that Cook screamed in pain, since he believed Cook was a god. Realizing Cook was human and could be killed, another man ran up and stabbed the captain between the shoulder blades. Within an hour of leaving the Resolution, and a few minutes after fighting broke out, Cook and 4 of his soldiers lay motionless on the beach in Hawaii. Thus ended the life of James Cook, and the 3rd expedition became his final one. It is still unknown what caused the sudden breakdown in relations between the ship's crew and the Hawaiians. It is assumed that the islanders must have doubted the divinity of Cook and his men when they saw the death of one of the sailors and the damage to the Resolution. It is also worth noting that Cook's end was as much of a surprise to him as it was to us. The breakdown in relations may have been due to the abuse of the islanders' hospitality. There is a theory that the Hawaiians regarded the English as exiles from a land where there must have been famine. However, at the time, the reasons for the natives' aggression were not the most important to the crew. After the battle, the Hawaiians taunted the immobilized British by parading on the beach in the uniforms of slain soldiers. The next day, under the cover of darkness, a priest approached the English, carrying a parcel. Unfortunately, the parcel contained Cook's head. When asked where the rest of him was, it was revealed that the natives had burnt the entirety of Cook's body, and the bones were divided between the king and the chiefs. Presumably, the ceremonial burning of Cook's body was a symbolic offering to the local god of war. It was a grim day aboard the ships indeed. The next day, repairs continued. Suddenly, one of the Havana men began throwing stones at the ship and twisting Cook's hat on his head, while the gathering crowd began to laugh and mock the slain captain. The islanders then pelted sailors, replenishing water supplies with stones. The pelting of the stones enraged the English, who began shooting at the natives and setting fire to nearby houses. The cruelty spiraled on. At one point, the British lost all patience. They cut off the natives' heads and fastened them to the boat. Captain Clark, who was ill with tuberculosis, was unable to stop the brutality of his men. On February 21st, after the ships had been repaired, it was time to return home. The Resolution crew lowered the flag to half-mast, fired a salute from 10 guns, and struck the bell. Cook's remains were placed in a coffin and buried at sea with all military honors. The final part of the voyage, which Captain Cook was present only in spirit, began. The repaired ships headed west to Asia. At the end of April 1779, Resolution and Discovery arrived in the port of Petropavlovsk in Kamchatka, from where Clark sent a letter to the Admiralty with the news of Cook's death and a personal commitment to continue the search for the Northwest Passage, the original goal of the expedition. The ships sailed to 70 degrees north latitude, but were again overcome by ice. The Northwest Passage remained unbeaten, and the return journey began. To make matters worse, on the 22nd of August 1779, Clark died of tuberculosis. The expedition lost both commanders in a short time. Clark was buried on Kamchatka under the willows by the crew. An Atlantic storm carried the expedition far north. The ships finally arrived home on the 4th of October 1780. News of Cook's and Clark's death had already reached London, so their return was accompanied by national mourning. Cook's account of his third and final voyage was completed by James King upon his return and spanned 3 volumes. As is often the case, the death of an author intensifies public interest. In this case, the entire print run of the account of the voyage sold out within 3 days, despite the high price. James Cook left no direct descendants, as all of his children died before having children of their own. However, Cook's travels and maps changed the understanding of the shape of islands and seas. He proved that Australia and New Zealand were suitable for colonization, discovered many islands in the Pacific Ocean, and established the extent of Australia and North America. While Cook was not able to penetrate the Antarctic polar circle, his belief that any southern island, including the Antarctic as we know it today, did not exist. While there is indeed no habitable Terra Australis, Cook's conclusions caused a hiatus of more than 50 years in the search of any southern continent. Similarly, the failure of the third expedition led Cook to theorize that the Northwest Passage did not exist, which was later proven incorrect. Cook's scientific output was impressive, and the botanists involved in the expeditions collected so many specimens of flora that the number of plants known in the Western world increased by 1/4. Botanist Parkinson also created over 1,300 drawings of plants, including 400 in Australia. During the expeditions, Cook introduced new hygienic habits for sailors, including regular cleaning of hammocks, clothing and bedding, compulsory bathing in the sea, ventilating the lower decks, and scrubbing the deck with vinegar. He also introduced vegetables, mainly sauerkraut and fruit, into the seaman's diet to combat scurvy. Some of the maps produced by Cook during his expeditions remained in use until the 1990s. For example, the map of New Zealand was still in use until 1994, when the Royal New Zealand Navy updated Cook's charts with the latest depth measurements and satellite data. Based on his diary entries, Cook is judged to represent 18th century Enlightenment, but he was not a devout man. He often used the word superstition in reference to faith of the people of Oceania and Western religion, but still held a service once a week for believing sailors. Although Cook's expeditions were historically overshadowed by the War of American Independence and the Napoleonic Wars, interest in his discoveries grew in the 19th century and continues to this day. The Endeavour ship was renamed Lord Sandwich and converted to a whaling ship before it sank in 1788. The Resolution also wrecked off the coast of Newport in 1794. It is worth noting that over the years, there has been increasing controversy about Cook's activities. Some accused him of interfering with foreign cultures under the banner of Western colonialism. In Hawaii and Tonga, there was a negative attitude towards Cook for many years, as he was considered to be responsible for the emergence of white colonizers who spread disease and destroyed local cultures. By far, the most common accusation made against Cook is that he opened the gates of Australia to the oppression of Aborigines. For 50,000 years, the Aborigines had little contact with other peoples, such as the Papuans. It was under the command of James Cook that white people first met with the Aborigines when he reached Botany Bay. At the dawn of European colonization, the Aboriginal population numbered around 800,000. Each of the 600 tribes had its own name, language, dialect, and separate territory. European settlers began to displace them from their fertile lands deep into the continent. For more than 100 years, Aboriginal people perished as a result of conflicts with white settlers due to lack of food and unknown diseases. By the beginning of the 20th century, Aboriginal people were considered to be dying out. Their numbers declined catastrophically until the 1930s, when their numbers were estimated to be only 67,000. Australian governments applied a policy of forced assimilation to Aborigines until the mid-1960s. It is only since 1965 that they have had full voting rights. Aboriginals to this day have a higher rate of unemployment and alcoholism than the rest of the population. However, their numbers are currently increasing. On the 13th of February 2008, the Prime Minister of Australia gave a speech in Parliament in which he apologised to Aboriginal people for discrimination and persecution, including practices leading to the so-called stolen generation. In 2018, a number of countries, including Australia and New Zealand, held official events commemorating Cook's voyages and discoveries. This sparked a wide debate about Cook's legacy, and various monuments in Australia and New Zealand were vandalised, with people wanting their removal. The vast majority of academics defend James Cook. Researcher Alice Proctor argues that Cook should never have been the target of any of these protests. Simply because he was the one who discovered those regions that were later colonized, he has become a victim of the wider debate about the decolonization of museums and public spaces, and colonialism in general. In other words, Cook became the face of later deeds that he really had nothing to do with. How then can we assess James Cook from today's perspective? Of course, everyone is entitled to make their own assessment, but here are my reflections. There is a tendency to blame Cook for what had happened many years after his discoveries. However, the subsequent treatment of indigenous populations under colonialism and imperialism has nothing to do with what Cook was doing. He was merely exploring, and decisions about what to do with new lands were made elsewhere. It is fair to judge Cook by his achievements and skills, which were immense. Even the commemorative plaque on his home in England proclaims, "This man's abilities changed the world." But let's leave the achievements aside for a moment. Cook was a remarkable and inspiring man. By his own efforts and persistence, he lived his dream life, climbing the career ladder twice, first as a civilian and then in the military. He self-studied complex areas of science and shed geographical light where others saw darkness. Cook's attitude towards his subordinates was exemplary, especially by the standards of the time. His concern for his men, extending even to the forced use of sauerkraut as a remedy against scurvy, was ahead of its time. It is worth noting that Cook never expressed contempt or mockery of any of the cultures he encountered. He promoted an understanding of otherness and viewed people wisely and humanely. What happened to indigenous populations later on, especially in Australia, is another story, but Cook cannot be blamed for it. The circumstances of Cook's voyages and his death in Hawaii have been the subject of much research. Today, medical science speculates that his change in character and fits of aggression were probably due to a streptococcal infection and intestinal parasites. At the same time, I would like to share a personal reflection. Despite all what he achieved, I doubt that James Cook was simply happy. All of his children died young, and during his absence on one of his expeditions, his son drowned. Cook's wife survived him and lived to a lonely old age. Despite writing millions of words in his diaries and reports, Cook never wrote anything about himself. No thoughts of doubtful memories or triumphs or dilemmas. Given the totality of his persona, it seems that Cook fought a lifelong battle with himself. Whenever he achieved a goal, he did not settle down or celebrate. Instead, he immediately set another target. So what does the story of James Cook tell us? On the one hand, it is worth aiming high, setting ambitious goals for ourselves and achieving them step by step. For whoever writes even one page every day will eventually write a book. On the other hand, Cook's biography shows that it is worthwhile to appreciate oneself, to congratulate oneself, and to say, "It's okay, I'm good enough." Cook lacked that kind of thinking, and in my opinion, it was that lack of it that pushed him to his third fateful expedition. If you enjoy this type of content, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more.